Hello everyone, this is Ron Williams with Web Builder Templates. Today's video is going to be about setting up WB at the start of a new project. And the question I have posed, as you can see, is there an optimal setup for WB? Um, the answer to that is there isn't a 100% setup that is, I can tell you, if you do this, you'll never ever have an issue. Um, but over the years of designing the templates and the sites I've done, I've had pretty good luck with these settings. So I thought I would kind of share a little bit of that with you. I know a lot of people ask what kind of settings should I use, how many breakpoints, what breakpoints should I use, um, and so this video is going to kind of talk about some of those things. I think anytime you start a new project, it's a good idea to kind of think about the project, get these things set in place before you start designing your website. I've broken it down into three areas that we'll take a look at. The first one's going to be page properties, the second one is going to be breakpoints, and the third will be the tools in the options section. So let's take a look at the page properties here. So on this first tab, there are several different things on here. Typically, the first thing that I do is I'm going to set the page width of the default view, which is right down here. Currently, it's at 970. Now, the default view should always be your largest view, and then your breakpoints should all be smaller than this. So this is the largest. So this is essentially, think of default as you're designing for desktop. Now, if you Google this and you look up what's the most common size of screens out there, years ago it used to be 1024 pixels was the width that you want to design for, and then as screens got bigger, that went to 1366. It's still pretty popular at that size. However, my monitor is a pretty big monitor, and I think people are buying bigger and bigger monitors. So right now I design starting out at 1920 as my page width for default. I have a big enough screen to design for it. Plus, you have to take into account, just like small screens, I think you have to start taking into account larger screens. You want your website to look as good on a large screen as it does a small screen. And I think if you design too small, potentially your website is going to look skinny on a big screen, and it's going to have a lot of dead space on the left and right hand side of your web page. So my page width is 1920. Now, before I type that in, one thing I have changed over the past year or so is I put a page width in that's a common page width or a common device size, but I always subtract 20 pixels from it. And the reason why I do this is to take into account the scroll bar. Scroll bars on different browsers are typically on average around 18 pixels or so, give or take. So it's just easier to design for 20 pixels, take into account 20 pixels for that. So instead of putting 1920 in here, I'm just going to put 1900. All right, that's what I'm going to set as my page width as default, where the other 20 is going to be, like I said, basically the scroll bar. That way, when I'm designing, my whole design is within that 1900, and the scroll bar has its own space, so I know my design is going to be seen as nothing's going to be cut off by the scroll bar or anything like that. And I will do this for every breakpoint. The next thing here is page alignment. If you look under page alignment, we have several different options here. Typically, I use really only two of these. The do not center page is the one I use the most. On occasion, I will use set page width and height to 100%. This one is used if you are creating full page, full screen websites where from section to section it's always 100% the width and height of the screen. If you're doing one of those types of websites, you may want to use this one. Otherwise, I use do not center page, and these two settings are for floating design. So if you're creating a fixed website where it's drag and drop, everything's, you're just using breakpoints, you're not using layout grids, you're not using any of that kind of stuff, then you'd want to use the center horizontally to keep your website centered. However, if you are designing a floating website and you're using layout grids and flex containers and flex grid, do not set it to center horizontally. I have seen a lot of demos sent to me where you're using layout grids and using center horizontally. That should be set to this at the very least. Do not center this page because you want everything floating. You don't want to have a center container. You don't need that. That's what the layout grids do. Never use the third one. Obviously, it says it's not recommended for RWD, and align left but include page width and height. Have not used that either. I'm not sure in what instance I would use that yet, so it's not something I can comment on. So we'll keep this as do not center the in the page. And then as far as your title of your page, and that's stuff I come back later to fill in. The two main things on this page that I would typically tell you to use is set your page alignment and your page width for your default. Okay, the page height does not matter because the height of your page is always going to be determined by the content on the page. This page height is only for the workspace, and that will get longer as you need it when you add more content. So there's no need to really adjust that at this point. Let's go on to style. On the style tab, here's where you're going to set typically the background of your website. You can set it to a solid, an image, whatever you want to set here. You can set your normal links for the page. So if you have links on your page, several links are all going to use the same colors for hover and different things. You would set your colors here. Okay. You can set up in the style manager different hyperlinks. There's all kinds of ways of setting up your links, but typically what I do is this is my base links. These are whatever color that I'm going to use for my links the most on the page. This is where I set it. It's just easier to set it here for the majority of your links. And then when you have a couple links on your page that you may want to be different colors, that's when you will use the hyperlink. Create your own separate ones. Default family, you can change this to whatever you'd like. I typically just leave it as Arial. You can change the line height, the size, all that kind of stuff here. Another popular thing I would suggest is enable responsive fonts. Um, I can't say enough about having responsive fonts. When you're on a big screen, you want some of the text to be bigger. You don't want tiny font on a huge desktop. So I typically always make my fonts bigger, and then as the screens get smaller in my breakpoints, I will make the text a little bit smaller as it gets down. I typically never go less than 12 on main text, but I would tell you to enable the responsive fonts so that way when you add a text block, it's always ticked and you're able to use responsive fonts. On the icons page, nothing here initially. This stuff is typically things I will add towards the end. I don't know at the beginning what my favicon necessarily is going to look like, so I kind of skip over this. Meta tags, kind of the same thing. These are things that I will add later once the site's getting more complete. Same way with SEO. I don't mess with this stuff at the beginning. Although there'll be some people out there that might say, well, look, I want to add some of this stuff in there now. That's fine. If you know what you want to add, do it now. But to get started, I kind of skip over this. On the miscellaneous, again, the only thing I would tell you on here is, as time goes on, you're gonna figure out whether you want to use a preloader for the page. If you've got stuff that's loading slow on the page, you might want to add a preloader to it. Lightbox, obviously, you're going to want to choose which lightbox is general for the page. And then at the top, master page. Again, at the very beginning of setting up your website, you may or may not know whether you're going to use a master frame or master page. So right now, leave it blank. Under the advanced tab, this is the default, as you can see. Typically, what I will do a lot of times is I always have a tendency to put the overflow X to hidden. This just kind of helps to ensure keeping from getting horizontal scroll bars sometimes when you don't want them. Doesn't always work. Some mobiles will ignore it, but it does help. It doesn't hurt really to put it on there. The only time this would really hurt is if you're trying to design a horizontal scrolling website, which not many people do. And then under the jQuery version, I typically will, at the minimum, will pick 2.24 or the 3.51. I typically do not use the older two unless for some reason there's some script you're using or an extension that requires these and just doesn't work with these two. But I haven't ran into too many extensions that won't work under 2.24, but will the older, So I think you're safe picking 2.24 at the minimum. Everything else I just kind of leave as is for now. And then, of course, the last tab is events. There's no events to add. That's what I would set up as my page. As you can see, I just set my page to 1900. So it is a lot wider here. So let's jump into breakpoints. So we're going to go down here and add, click on manage breakpoints. The screen comes up. One thing I would say on this screen right now is there's two options. These can get kind of confusing. I will tell you 99% of the time, most issues, and the easiest way to do this is to make sure you pick the second one, activate breakpoints when browser window is larger than the device width. This is going to add min and max widths into your breakpoints. And without getting all technical, basically what we'll get back to that. Let's add some breakpoints. We'll come back to that thought. So the question I've been asked is, well, what breakpoints do I add? Well, the answer to that question is there's a couple things I would say. Is one, you only want to add a breakpoint if your design calls for it. What that means is let's say you have a photo gallery. Let's say it's to a point where if the photo gallery, you've got a row of 5 pictures. Well, there's going to be a point where those 5 pictures in a row, horizontal row, are going to get too small, and you're going to need to change it so that maybe it only shows 2 in a row. Well, you need a breakpoint, and where you put that breakpoint is up to you. It's at the point where you feel that the pictures are too small and they need to flip. But in general, this is what I will tell you about breakpoints. If I was setting up breakpoints right now, not even knowing my design, here's what I would pick. Since I have 1920 as my big screen and I made it 1900, remember I subtracted 20 from it for the scroll bar. My next one is 1366. That's the next common size of monitor. Okay, and you could pick 1366 and probably have no problems. Again, I'm going to take into account the scroll bar, so I'm going to actually make it 1346. Okay. From there, what is my next breakpoint? Well, based on a lot of sites that I visited that track different widths of different devices, everything from mobile phones and tablets all the way up. What I've had the best luck is the next one after 1366 common size is 1024. You're going to find many tablets are 1024 tall in portrait mode. Some bigger phones might show 1024 pixels. So I will use that as my next one. Of course, I'm going to subtract 20 and make it 1004. All right. My next breakpoint after 1004 is I'm going to drop down to 768. That seems to be a very common size, again, with some tablets and some phones. I will subtract 20 from that, so I'm going to use 748 as my breakpoint. My next size down from that typically is around 480. Again, many smaller or larger phones peak out at around, that or less. Some of your larger phones, and I find that to be a very uh, and 480 also is pretty close to some of the older Amazon the little tablets that they made, Kindles, and that has a tendency to be pretty close. So I'm going to subtract 20, then I'll go 460. And then the last one is, again, this is going to be your taste, and depending on where you're at, maybe you have more people that have smaller phones. Where I'm at, it's hard. They don't make 320 pixel phones much anymore. And I think when you look at a lot of the phones out there now, the minimal is 360. There are tons of phones that 360 is the device with, and so I typically, that is my lowest point I go. Of course, I'm going to subtract 20 just for the scroll bar. I'll make it 340. And those are the five breakpoints I typically will use if I need all five. Now there may be instances where I don't need maybe the 460. Maybe I'm good from 748 down to 340. Or same way with 748. Maybe I can go from 1000 for it. It all depends on your design. And that's going to be up to you whether or not you think you need it. But typically, those five breakpoints I've used numerous times, and I can honestly say I've never had any real issues with my websites looking good on different devices, to the point where I'll be honest with you, when I design websites, it's not uncommon for me to take a trip down to Best Buy or wherever you're at, your local electronics store, and I've played around with different tablets, phones, desktops, everything, and checking out my sites to see how they look. And I've never really ran into a problem where they don't look good based on those numbers. So I think if you use these numbers in your own design, you won't have to worry so much about it whether or not it's going to look right on a device or not. Now, if there's other issues, that might be something to do with your design. But as far as breakpoints are concerned, these I tried and true for me. I've not had any problems with them. So we'll hit OK, and we've added all those breakpoints down here. So we got our default view, which is the 1900 or 1920 if you're looking at a monitor size, and from there down are my five breakpoints. So those are the ones that I would use. And then lastly, let's touch base on tools and options. This is important. So if we go up to tools, we hit options. There's a lot of different options here, and the ones that I want to touch base on is the HTML section. Now, I'm not going to say what I'm telling you is 100% right. Everybody's going to have their own opinion on it. I'm a big believer on trying to keep things organized. So when JS files, CSS files, fonts, media files, when those things are all generated by WB, I like to keep things organized. So starting here, I always enable, this is default, I leave it. The second one, enable your encoding to prevent web unsafe file names. I typically uncheck that because I have found that sometimes adds some weird characters in my file names. It, instead of putting a dash, it gives the code for it, which I'm not a fan of. It changes it. So I usually leave that unchecked, and I've not had any issues. Include page name and automatically generated ID attributes. I have seen some people's files that have been sent to me that have used this. I'm not a fan of it. First of all, it makes your IDs extremely long, and more complicated than they need to be, which is something we will cover in another video. Um, I usually leave that unchecked. I will go back and name the IDs in my page to something that makes sense, which is again something we'll talk about later. Use shared folder for assets. Again, that's totally up to you whether you want to use that or not. Same thing with the use HTML5 semantic tags. Again, nothing wrong if you want to check that and use them. Great. Um, the enable cache busting is something new. I've not had any real issues with that, but it may be something that you need. By all means, use it. In the formattings, I set them all to minify. One, because Google wants your code to be as quick as possible, and by minifying your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, it's going to make it as fast as possible. So I recommend setting the formatting to minify. Under CSS, the generate external style sheets, I highly recommend that. I also highly recommend generate a single style sheet for global styles. Um, and then the third one, optimize inline styles. This will move everything to the style sheet. So in your code, you're not going to have a bunch of styles. That's going to move it to a separate sheet that will be in a CSS folder, which we'll get to here shortly. The fourth one here, move style sheets to the end of the page. It's a good thing if you can use it. And it depends on your design and what's going on your page. Sometimes this works great. You don't have any problems. Google likes it because it moves it to the end. It's loaded later, so it speeds up the page a bit. But sometimes it can cause some problems because you're going to see you might see a flash of something on your screen and then it changes because it hasn't loaded the style sheet yet. So this is an iffy one here that you got to play with to see if you notice if it makes your design look good or bad. Use CS3 gradients instead of images when possible. Always have that checked. Publish navigation icons as SVG image. Again, that's totally up to you whether you want to use that or not. If you're only using a few, it's probably worth using. Keep inline styles. I don't ever click this. Um, and then under JavaScript, as these two, I always use these two. Generate a JS file for specific page scripts and move the JavaScripts to the end of the page. Google likes that, as well as when you generate the JS files, it's putting them in a folder all by themselves, just the JS files. So this is typically how I set up my HTML fonts. Under this, I typically will always automatically use font face for web save fonts. So if you're using Google Fonts, WB will automatically generate the code for you. However, if you insert some sort of font in your web page that's not a Google font and you don't already have font face set up for it, this will automatically create it for you. It's very handy. Files and folders, nothing there. I just use the defaults. Publish. This is the other spot that I want to talk about. Down here is the folder where certain things are kept. So as you can see, any images that are BMP, JPEG, GIF, PNG are put into a folder called images. And you can add as many file types here as you want. I highly suggest this. I would highly suggest entering a CSS. So when you put this here, we'll click on that and we'll edit it. It's very simple. The extension is CSS and it's going to go into a folder called CSS. So that means all your style sheets will be placed into this folder, nice and neat and orderly. And I do the same thing for my JS files. I put JS, it goes into a folder called JS. Now you can call the folder whatever you want, as long as you could call this JavaScript, not just JS. It can be whatever you like it. as long as you put in there, I highly recommend adding your CSS and JS files into a separate folder. If you don't, then a lot of times those go into the same folder or the root folder with your HTML files, and it gets messy. This keeps everything organized in its own folder. I also do the same thing with my fonts. I put in TTF, WAF, I've got EOT, SVG, I've got WAF2, and OTF. All those go into a folder called fonts. This keeps everything nice and neat. All my fonts go into a folder, and they're not just sporadically put into the root folder. And, to me, I like to keep everything together and neat and orderly. So what does this look like when you publish? Here's an example. Here's a folder. This is the files that I published. Here's my HTML file. And as you can see, by creating these folders, all my CSS files go in a folder labeled CSS, the JS. I have, of course, the images one is the one that always is made, and then I have fonts. And see, if I click on here, here's the fonts that I used in this particular project. Here's all my CS files. Of course, the JS files that are all needed. And of course, you got your images. This one didn't have any images, and then you got your HTML. It keeps everything very neat. And this is how it would look like on your server when you upload it. It'll keep everything very organized. The other kind of great thing about this, especially if you're someone that uses FileZilla, I can easily make an update to this page. And if, let's say, I just simply switch the position of an object, well, that's all handled by CSS. I can simply publish this page again, and then with FileZilla, I can go in here and just simply upload the file, the CSS file, and that's it. I don't need to upload anything else because it's a CSS file that controls the positioning. It makes it easier for me, and it's a lot quicker. I don't have to worry about messing with the HTML file or anything like that. So again, this is just my personal, what I feel is good practice. Of course, there'll be plenty of people that think differently and have other ideas, but this has always worked for me, and I just kind of wanted to pass it on to everybody, especially for the people that are new and just getting started. I think putting these ideas into practice each and every time, you always get good results. So if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave them below. If there's anything else that I can talk about or explain a little more or why we do it this way, please let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks again.